1963, we have a long preview for you.
Yeah, we're only halfway through here, so we've got a bonus double episode. Lucky you.
Woo. Woo.
So we should say a couple of words about Dafydd Rees, the author of an incredibly important new book just released that happens to be about, 1963. We'll link to it in the episode notes, and you really should take a look at it. It is extensively researched. It features day-by-day rundown of everything the Beatles did during the year, alternating with interviews with so many people who were there who have been rarely and sometimes never interviewed before.
We used his book to perform a kind of hybrid analysis, content and thematic, to come up with the descriptions you're about to hear of the exponential increase in mania and media coverage throughout the year 1963 across Britain. No, we don't define mania, but you know it when you see it. Yes, it's unmeasurable, but we'll explain in a couple of minutes.
Right. So, how are we going to summarize this year in the UK?
I noticed the other day, Chris Booker, writing in The Spectator some years back, more recently, looked back on 1963, maybe a few years ago. The editors gave his piece this headline: Profumo, Chatterley, The Beatles, 1963 was the year Old England died. And this subhead, 12 months that brought heaps of snow, satire, sex, pop, and ended with an event that outstripped all the rest. Now, if anyone can't guess what that last event was, hint, hint, it was atrocious. And it happened in Dallas, not in London.
Yeah.
A well-known contrarian, Booker was a British journalist who got his start in 1961 as a founder of the satirical magazine Private Eye. So you'd think that he would have been anti-establishment. No, it's subtle in this article, but he sort of bemoans the death of Old England. Anyway, he sums up the year really well. So this Spectator article serves as a useful companion to this episode of Beatles60. One key line in his piece is this: in December, a special edition of the Evening Standard summed up 1963 as having been simply the year of the Beatles. So we'll link to this on our episode page.
Yeah.
That's the conventional way of looking at the start of the swingin' 60s, centered around swingin' London. But there are other historians who point out that most Britons remained as they were, kind of in the 50s, right into the 60s. They weren't wearing miniskirts and stuff,
Right.
Or into drug parties or transcendental meditation or psychedelia.
Yeah.
So let's keep in mind that the transformation that happens after the big freeze thaws out in the spring of 1963 is kind of a little bit of a cliche and a little bit true. For every show, we assemble many, many links that listeners can explore. Did you know this, listener? And
I knew
getting there, what did you say, Andy?
I knew it. I knew about it.
You knew it, yeah?
Yeah.
Getting there is easy. You got a pen or a pencil? Not you, Andy, I mean the listener. Our podcast website is Beatles60.group. That's 60 in digits, 60. Go there, Beatles60.group. You can find episodes in the menu, or maybe podcast episodes. I forget what we call it. Or type this into your browser, Beatles60.group/blog. You'll see the episodes list. We really do try to give lots of links for each episode, so please do check out the episode page of Beatles60.group. Andy, what do you think of the links? What's your thought about that?
Well, it's kind of hard for me to give an unbiased opinion since I actually find a lot of those links. But I think that, yes, I think that they are really, really important. You could spend so much time just like going through all of those links and watching all the videos and reading the articles and things, even longer than it takes to listen to the podcast itself.
I think so. So, you can take a deep dive. We're just the diving board. Maybe the most useful information we can offer listeners of this episode would be a basic chronology of 1963 and the exponential rise of the mania. A year is usually, of course, divided into quarters or into 12 months, conventionally, right? We're going to divide 1963 into 7 uneven segments because we want to. No, because that's how it happened, At each step, we're going to offer an extremely unscientific but informative measurement of mania as it sweeps the UK. So, listener, please understand that for each segment, the percentage of mania isn't meant to reveal some kind of meaningful quantification of anything. Pay no attention to the numbers. In the following chronology, percentage of mania just helps us to remember what their cultural reach was roughly at each stage in 1963 in Britain. Not in the world, in Britain. Gradually, the rest of the world sort of sees news reports and things, and they do go to Sweden and then to Paris and then to the US, but they're not in America yet in 63, right? Right. Are they in Paris in 63? No, that's also 64, right?
That's at the beginning of 64, yeah.
Right. So just Sweden and Britain and Sweden at the end of the year.
Yeah.
We're deliberately conflating 3 ways of asking the question, how big or intense or newsworthy was UK Beatlemania at this stage? The point is to help ourselves remember what these periods within 1963 were like and get a sense of the increasing rapidity of the growth and scope of the mania as the year progressed.
The rest of the year will be a wild ride, so buckle your seatbelts. Or mind the gap if you're on public transportation. Why don't we highlight what's going to happen in 1963? Segment 1. From January to mid-March. In January, people were staying indoors and watching TV due to the big freeze. Perfect timing for the Beatles to finally make their first appearance on Thank Your Lucky Stars, just a week after Please Please Me was released as their second single. Thanks to Rob Gurtzen, by the way, for his insights into the big freeze and Thank Your Lucky Stars. So that, and the fact that the boys would begin a nationwide tour with Helen Shapiro for just about the whole month of February, would push the new single up the charts. In terms of what was happening on the charts, Love Me Do, the first single, was at its highest level, number 17 on January 1st, and started its way down after that, basically, falling completely off the chart on February 14th. But by the following week, February 21st, Please Please Me had worked itself up to number 2, its highest position. I know what you're thinking. Some charts had it listed at number 1, but the official consolidated chart didn't have it higher than number 2, and so that's how it kind of goes down in history on the official UK charts.
Just missed.
Yeah. Through mid-March, that was the only record the Beatles had on the chart. The result of having 2 hits now, though, was that audience started responding to the Beatles in a way that is very familiar to us looking back now. On January 21st, There were screams at the EMI house as the Beatles recorded for the Friday Spectacular on Radio Luxembourg. The next day, fans tried to rip the door off of their taxi.
Whoa.
The reports are similar for the next couple of months. Lines for tickets ran for blocks. At the Astoria in Oldham on February 12th, 1,200 people were turned away. On the last day of the Helen Shapiro tour, March 3rd, hundreds of teenagers packed the stage door. John...
Wait, could I ask you?
Yeah.
Without Please Please Me in the charts and without Thank You Lucky Stars, would any of this have been happening?
I can't imagine.
Right.
I mean, they would have had one minor hit. So,
yeah. Yep.
About the mob thing, though, it's like, John told Derek Adams from the Evening Sentinel. Adams asked him how he felt about being mobbed, and John said, the time to start worrying is when it doesn't happen. Right? The popularity of the Beatles would cause some awkward moments on tour. Helen Shapiro was asked by Granada theater manager Ivan Morgan in Bedford if she would mind the Beatles getting top billing.
Whoa.
Andrew Loog Oldham was at that show, and he said the crowd was louder than the music. And we've heard that before, right? He said, beyond adolescent sexuality, it was the sound of the future. Heard the whole world screaming.
Wow.
Further, on March 10th, at the Hippodrome in Birmingham, when the Beatles were supporting Chris Montez at that point, Montez was booed. And the crowd chanted, "We want the Beatles." And in case you don't know, Chris Montez and Tommy Moore, who the Beatles were opening for at that point, were American singers.
And wasn't he like chubby and taking off his shirt and stuff?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
And they thought it was gross?
Yeah. But as far as the press was concerned, the reception of the Beatles was actually fairly cool. They did get some good notices from papers like the Sheffield Star, who said that the Beatles deserved top billing on the Chris Montez tour, and called them, this is a quote, the hottest new property on the pop scene. But more reviews didn't share the sentiment. The Bristol Evening Post, Times Herald, Cambridge News all panned them. The Cambridge News called it I love this British understatement. That's the way, as an American, the way I see it, right? The Cambridge News called it not the best show Cambridge audiences have seen.
So, yeah, we definitely see the press not getting it where the kids are getting it.
Yeah, exactly. But a couple more small things of note. All of what we're talking about was happening in the UK, but VJ Records in the US did release Please Please Me. And we'll be talking later about the whole how Capitol was involved, and which was part of EMI and all that. We'll get there. But VJ Records released Please Please Me, and at this point it didn't sell well at all. Capitol Records A&R guy Alan Livingston told George Martin that the record was not suitable for the U.S. market. So last, and very interestingly, on February 28th, on their coach ride to their show in Shrewsbury, John and Paul wrote a song. That song was called From Me to You, and that would end up being their next single. A very busy few months. Larry, what is the level of nationwide mania?
Sounds like 30% mania among British youth, or amongst, as they would say, British youth. That may sound low, but it means the intensity of the reaction really begins to be noticed at their appearances. Audiences had been enthusiastic going all the way back to Litherland at the end of 1960, but this is a nationwide scope, and the intensity has gone from like 5% to 30% just in a couple of months, or a month maybe. For most successful acts, this would be their peak, their 100%. For the Beatles, we know what the 100% benchmark will be eventually. So at 30% during the big freeze, that's pretty great, and they must know it.
Yeah.
Adults, as you said, not grasping it yet. Media not quite getting it.
Yeah.
Fascinating to compare with just over a year earlier, the 9th of December 1961 in Aldershot. Liverpool promoter Sam Leach, remember, had this idea of bringing Liverpool beat groups down to London in a series of weekly showcases. The first one featured the Beatles. Unfortunately, as you'll recall, there was some snafu with the ad, and he thought he had placed an ad in the local paper, but the payment didn't go through or something. The check bounced or something or other.
Yeah.
The first show was completely unadvertised, therefore. If they hadn't pulled people off the street, the Beatles would have played to an empty ballroom dance floor.
Right.
The industry people he'd invited didn't show up because Aldershot was almost 40 miles outside of London. As it was, they were able to attract fewer than 20 punters.
Yeah.
You can see a whole roll of photos with the Beatles on stage and maybe 6 couples ballroom dancing, not even looking at the stage. That was their first gig in the south of England.
Yeah.
All right. Just a year ago. And now compare that near nothingness to like 14 or 15 months later, the South got the mania, but it keeps growing faster and faster. Next, 1963 segment, please, Maestro.
Segment 2.
Segment 2.
Mid-March to mid-May. By mid-April, the Beatles had finished up successful national tours with Helen Shapiro, followed by Chris Montez and Tommy Moore. They'd be headlining their own UK tour through May and had received a silver disc for 250,000 sales of Please Please Me. The album of the same name was released on March 22nd and was on its way to number 1. Number 1 album, where it would remain for an astonishing 30 weeks. And their third single, From Me to You, less than 2 months after it was written, was released on April 24th. And it would be their first number 1 single.
Da, 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 da.
Across the UK charts, not just the couple. It was the consolidated number 1 for an incredible 7 weeks.
Now, the first album, wasn't it the conventional wisdom at the time was that albums were for adults and it had to be jazz or something like that?
Yeah, jazz, comedy, yeah. Oldies.
Yeah, so the idea was that, teens aren't going to buy albums. What are you kidding? They buy singles.
Yeah.
So they keep breaking the conventional wisdom every time, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now they'd hit the big time. They'd hit the big time.
That's
in the UK.
Just in the UK, yes, that's right. But what's interesting is that, the 7 weeks that From Me to You was number 1, this was a big surprise for me because, my background was like knowing what the US singles did, right? But that 7 weeks, they would not match that number of weeks at number 1 on the UK chart until Hello Goodbye in 1967. So yeah, it's absolutely big time. You may ask, how was the audience reaction going at this point?
Hey, Andy.
Well, yeah.
How was the audience reaction going at this point?
Well, it's interesting that you ask that. Because I'll tell you that 6,000 fans packed the Empire Ballroom for a return home to Liverpool. 6,000. In Mansfield, hundreds of girls blocked off the streets outside the Granada. At the Odeon in London, the Beatles were bombarded on stage with toys and chocolate, and the stories that would eventually become jelly babies being thrown. In Gledless, the show had to be moved from the Black Cat, which held 500 people, because 2,000 tickets had been sold. In Croydon, ushers had to guard the stage. The Nelson Leader reported that on May 11th, around 50 girls were carried backstage after fainting. They said, quote, this is a quote, "It looked like a battlefield." There were a few good reviews these months. The Northampton Chronicle and Echo said the Beatles were, quote, "not long before worldwide acclaim." And this is in May, and so there's an early The Liverpool Echo, of course, said that the Beatles, quote, were revitalizing and revolutionizing the British top 20 scene. No surprise that Liverpool Echo would be behind them. But so many others still didn't get it yet. This is one of my favorites. Richard Sear of the Daily Mirror said the Beatles' barber deserved credit for straight comedy.
Yeah, that's the kind of attitude we got at first from American media as well.
Yeah, exactly. The Croydon Advertiser review said, either you like beat music or you don't, and I don't. Others simply complained that the shows were ruined by the Screaming Girls. In Manfield and in Leicester, media outlets didn't even bother sending anyone. A couple more things of interest. Around the end of April, BBC studio manager Vernon Lawrence suggested that there should be a weekly radio show called Beatle Time with John and Paul hosting. They would showcase musical guests each week. And that exact thing didn't happen, but we'll get to, there will be something like that does happen before too long. Finally, the Beatles fan club was receiving over 1,000 letters per week. This is one of my favorite stories ever. There was a fan letter that contained 4 pieces of chewing gum with a request that the Beatles chew the gum and then send them back in the enclosed envelopes.
Now, wait a minute. When they sent it back, were they supposed to put their names like separate?
They must have been.
Or just mush them all together? Ugh.
Yeah, that would have been fun. You have to guess which one it is. I don't know. But, yummy, huh?
Gross.
What's the level of nationwide mania now, Larry?
Apparently, more than half of adults still not getting it. But the youth are absolutely caught up in the mania, wouldn't you say?
I would say so, yes.
Let's call it 60% among the youth.
60.
Yeah, I think so. The mania has doubled quarter on quarter. But what does the summer bring?
Well, we're going kind of long on this, and there's a whole lot to get through. 5 more segments, so how should we go about this?
Well, over the coming year, we'll be going into monthly detail, mostly from Dafydd Rees' book, especially, and other sources too, into detail every month. We've researched the first half of the year, and now we're at the halfway point. The rest of it we know from other people's articles, books, podcasts, and so on. So today we're just going to rely on the basic consensus that's out there for the remaining segments of 1963, the latter half, which is beyond incredible, what happens to our boys. By the way, I recommend a particular episode of Beatles Naked Podcast with Richard Buskin and Eric Taros, where they focus on this year, 1963, an episode titled The Profumo Affair, Sex, Lies, ... and Beatlemania. We'll link to that on our episode page. There are also recent episodes of various podcasts featuring Dafydd Rees, talking about 1963. We'll link to what we can find. Okay, moving along faster now.
Right. Back to a quick rundown of the remaining segments, eh? Segment 3, mid-July 1963. The Beatles are on tour in the UK with Roy Orbison. A tour that would last into September. For Me to You, it was finishing its run on the UK singles chart, but the July 13th release of the Beatles' first EP, Twist and Shout, would be another milestone. The EP, along with the title track, featured A Taste of Honey, Do You Want to Know a Secret, and There's a Place, all songs that had been released before. It would stay on the UK EP chart for 64, that's 64 weeks. 21 of them at number 1.
I want to note something.
Yeah.
That, like we said, they went from this leather rock band to a suited pop group, right?
Yeah.
And now they're really pushing A Taste of Honey and Do You Want to Know a Secret everywhere on their TV appearances and everything.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because these are, I don't know, not typical 4/4 hard beating rock songs.
Yeah, right.
It's cool.
Yeah. But it's amazing. I'm going to have a lot more to say, by the way, as we go on, because I'm finding a lot of this out. EPs have never been that big of a deal, but they were kind of then in the UK, and we're going to have a whole lot to say about a series of EPs that the Beatles put out. But the Twist and Shout EP was amazing. 21 weeks at number one, basically keeping the other Beatles EPs out of the number one spot. But we'll get there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting thing we'll talk about later, too.
Yeah.
My first memory was before there were any American albums.
Yeah.
Like before VJ, just like a week before or 2 weeks before, just before. But the DJs were making a big deal about it in America. So this is jumping way ahead to early 1964.
Yeah.
But one of my sisters brought home an Odeon French pressing of an EP. And that was my first. I played it on my little Bozo player. I think we've talked about this before, haven't we?
I think so.
I love to tell that story. Oh, what a great story. Okay. Let's move on.
Okay. So where are we now in Nationwide Mania?
You would think that this would be the peak of mania. I mean, how much more intense, how much bigger, how much better press would be possible? Yet, we're only around 80%.
80%.
80%. So that leaves a little bit of space to get to 100.
Yeah.
And I would say 20, to get to 100.
I think that's close, at least.
Yeah. So please, late summer, what happened?
Segment 4. August to September of 1963. The Roy Orbison tour was still going strong. On August 23rd, the Beatles' fourth single would be released. She Loves You. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. By 4 weeks later, it was number one. Meanwhile, across the pond, it may be worth saying as we head towards 1964 that She Loves You was actually the third Beatles single to be released in the U.S., all on different labels, since EMI-owned Capitol Records refused to release them. And at this point, they were not doing all that well in the States. They were not charting.
Dick Clark on American Bandstand shows a photo of the Beatles to some teens in the crowd, and the kids laughed.
Yeah. But who cares about the U.S.?
I mean, they all had those crew cuts like a little carpet top of the boys anyways.
That's right.
And the girls had these kind of big hairspray do's. But
the U.S., who cares? Who cares about the U.S.?
Yeah, screw the U.S.
Nationwide Mania in the U.K. had risen that much more. Had it reached 100% yet?
Yes, 100%. Now, what pushed it over the top? I guess She Loves You did it, that...
She Loves You, Twist and Shout EP, yeah.
Yeah, those two things, right. If we try to pinpoint the start of absolute nationwide mania, it was sometime between the Twist and Shout EP and She Loves You single.
Yeah, because that's She Loves You. We've got two number one singles now. Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah.
So was probably pretty rare at the time too.
And a number one album. And a number one EP.
I mean, Cliff and the Whoozamacallits might have been on two places on the chart, but the top two, I don't know if anyone had. Maybe broke a record, did it? I don't know.
I have to look that up. Yeah.
We'll find out.
Yeah.
Even adults and the press were seeing the Fab Four in 3 dimensions by now. That's a big deal. So,
yeah.
And that usually doesn't happen with pop groups at all, even successful ones, that you'll become a household name. So some I don't get it types remained oblivious, but the Beatles, even in their 4 individual names, were becoming like household names across the UK as news of the mania traveled even beyond its borders. So, the New York Times had a little tiny thing, not about the music, but about the screaming or the phenomenon or whatever.
Right. Segment 5. October 1963, the Beatles had enjoyed a well-earned 2-week rest at the end of September. But October would get them right back to work. Shows were becoming bigger and bigger. They played the London Palladium on October 13th.
I turned 3 that day.
You say it's your birthday! Yeah. A short tour of Sweden soon followed. And what happened at the end of that tour is the stuff of legends.
Ooh.
On Halloween, October 31st, the Beatles flew back to London from Stockholm. It is said that 10,000 Beatles fans were waiting to greet them. And the stories say that by coincidence, Ed Sullivan happened to be arriving in London at the same time and took note of the response to the Beatles. He would soon make arrangements with Brian Epstein to have our boys travel to New York for a live television appearance. I would say that if UK Mania wasn't already at 100%, it sure was now, don't you think?
Oh, I think so, 100%. And they'd conquered the mainstream culture. Now, I was just thinking while you said that, that eventually Eric Howell's Beatle drama is going to do the airport scene. It'll be like,
yes.
Arrivals coming from Stockholm.
In 5 minutes, flight number 3. Really big shoe. Where's my suitcase?
Well,
look at that.
Looks like we could have a really big shoe with these guys.
They look big. There's crowds like that I haven't seen like that since Elvis. Oh.
All right. Segment 6. November 1963. The Beatles' fame could seemingly go no higher in the UK at this point. It was capped by their appearance at the Royal Command Performance. You know, the one where John said that thing, you know, that y'all know.
The people in the cheaper seats clap your hands.
But cheaper seats.
The rest of you just rattle your jewelry.
Right, yeah, that whole thing, yeah.
There's a special lady in the audience tonight. Barry's mom.
Barry's mom. Well, okay, that reference. Well, no, everybody here is a Ruddles fan, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But what to do about bringing that mania to the U.S.? Brian met with Ed Sullivan on November 11th to start working out a deal for the Beatles to appear on The Really Big Shoe. I give a lot of credit to Sullivan. The Beatles had not made much of a splash in the U.S., obviously, with singles that had been released so far had not charted, but he was pretty sure he saw something in them.
Yeah, I think people don't give enough credit. We just say they came on his show, but and I think Brian Epstein doesn't get enough credit sometimes for how this worked out, because we'll see when we get to the end of 1963, that both Epstein and Sullivan together in their meeting in New York made brilliant compromises. It was like a one-on-one negotiation before the Beatles came. So just Brian flew over and, you know, brilliant.
So clearly still at 100% in the UK, right?
Yes. I mean, by this time it had reached historic levels. The only question was whether it could go global. And we've already hinted that, more than hinted, that it was about to.
A little bit, yeah.
There was one teen market they hoped to tap into, especially.
Segment 7. 1963 moves towards 1964. I Want to Hold Your Hand is released in the UK. And along with She Loves You, all right, the Beatles hold the number 1 spot on the UK singles chart for 7 of the last 8 weeks of the year. And then I Want to Hold Your Hand was still number 1 after, beginning the next year, but yeah. And then things started moving quickly in the US. On December 1st, the New York Times Magazine published a small article about UK Beatlemania, focusing on the fighting and broken bones that would happen at their concerts. So they still had the little bit of a, that was their focus.
Yeah, that was the story.
Yeah. But I Want to Hold Your Hand was released in the US on December 26th, and for the first time, it was actually released by Capitol. But Capitol Records owned by EMI, and we obviously at the time, when the time comes, we'll be talking about the story, and there is a story about how EMI, convinced Capitol to start releasing Beatles stuff.
They had to apply a bit of pressure, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Imagine, I just had a funny thought. Imagine if the Beatles story was all about all the time, like how crazy the audience was, if that's the way it was all through the 60s.
Yeah, right.
They played at Shea Stadium, and there was so many broken bones and fainting, and it was a battlefield.
The rooftop concert, people were getting into fights down below on the street.
And some people fell off the roof, and it was a disaster. The Beatles. Watch out, look at it, like the Beatles as Godzilla or something. Oh no, it's the Beatles, run! And after all their reluctance, Capitol went all in and put a hefty marketing budget behind it. And how effective was that?
Well, as the famous story goes, the Beatles were in the middle of a 3-week residency at the Olympia in Paris. And just because I want to throw this in there, I saw Ringo play at the Olympia a couple of years ago.
What?
Yes. What? And he didn't say a word about having played there with the Beatles, but in any case. So they did a 3-week residency at the Olympia in Paris, and in the middle of that, on January 26th, they received the news that they were number 1 in the US. I think you might say the rest is history.
They must have had like a fast heartbit at that moment,
oh God. Yeah. I wonder if they were on stage, like Mal ran out on stage, and that's the way I want to remember it, no matter what. Right. Even though I'm sure it didn't happen.
Sure, let's make it up. We can do that. Yeah. People don't have to rely on us for anything, like the truth or reality.
Oh wait! I'm supposed to be doing only truth. Isn't that what I do now? Yeah. Okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And a big event on the day that Andy was born, will keep you in suspense.
That was kind of a big day for me.
Yeah, because you were born.
Yeah.
It's important that you had been born, because now, then 60 years or 64 years later.
Yeah.
Is that right?
No, it'll be 60 years exactly for when they play on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Ah, there you go. You gave it away.
Okay, we'll cut that. Don't use that part then.
No, it's okay. It's all right. Who listens this far into a double podcast anyways?
Right.
If you want to share a segment of this podcast episode, please feel free. The easiest way to do that is to find and share the YouTube clip. We make a few segment clips for each of these Beatles60 episodes. So you can find these under the links on each episode's page at beatles60.group/blog.
Yes, get them, send them to your friends, your parents, your grandparents. Yeah. Your children, your enemies. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's about it for today, don't you think? Double episode and all. A lot of things to think about.
I hope that what we've done in this double episode has been helpful for us, for listeners, all of us, to remember the scope of pre-Mania 1960 to 62, and then right through the amazing 1963, right up to just before conquering America.
Yeah. Thanks again to Rob Geertsen and to Dafydd Rees Thanks very much to David Bedford. And of course, Denise!
The voice of Ringo was Eric King Mixer-Howell. Peace and love.
As always, an amazing job. Listen to A Day in Their Life. Thanks for listening.
Peace and love.
We'll talk to you again next month. See you, Larry.
Yeah, see ya, mate.
Nothing to do to save his life, call his wife in. Nothing to say but what a day, how's your boy been? Nothing to do, it's up to you. I've got nothing to say, but it's okay. Good morning, good morning, good morning. It's 5 o'clock, everywhere in town is getting dark. Everyone you see is full of life. It's time for tea and meet the wife. Somebody needs to know the time, glad that I'm here. Watching the skirt, you start to flirt, now you're in gear. Go to a show, you hope she goes. I've got nothing to say, but it's okay. Good morning, good morning, good.
this was only part of a longer audio podcast. You can find one or two other parts of this episode on our YouTube channel. We post audio to YouTube only in short segments to make them easy to share. If your purpose is to share short segments of our audio podcast, then the YouTube clips can be convenient, but our YouTube channel is just for segments. It's audio, so there's nothing to look at. We're not really interested in producing video content. So, for Beatles60, to tell you the truth, the YouTube channel is really where the action isn't. If you want a continuous listening experience for yourself while washing up or while hiking or while commuting, similar to listening to audiobooks, then we recommend getting our full podcast episodes automatically sent to your phone or your tablet or your PC every month. Use a podcast app. It's easy to find us and subscribe. There's a link in the show notes, or you can always go to Beatles60.group. You see, you navigate down to one of the episode pictures on the front page, and then you tap that, and then there's a description of the episode, and then listen now, and then you tap that, and you can choose any podcast app that works for you. Or you could listen right there if you want to.
This is Beatles60.
The interval between this podcast and our next podcast will, 60 years ago, have been the exact same interval.
Get the idea? The Beatles will have experienced the exact same number of days, same season. All of you who have been following this real-time chronicle with us already get the pace.
You already understand, right? Same speed. Technically, we'd call this a longitudinal phenomenological historiographic study.
Larry,
Eh?
what's with all the academic jargon?
Well, this is a serious series. The Earth turns at one speed and in one way, am I right? At least in lived experience, last I looked. Now remember, the future is unwritten.
Ultimately, we're talking about human experience. We can't walk in the Beatles' boots if we're jumping around all different billions and billions of years, as nothing would make any sense.
So come on, we gotta repeat that slogan. This is a chronicle. Beatles60, we ain't jumping around.